in this workshop, we are going to discuss the alternatives to redundancy. So before we get started, I'm just going to quickly introduce myself. So my name is Kelly. I'm one of the HR advisors for Code iComply, and this is my colleague Sophie.
Hi there. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name's Sophie. I'm a senior HR advisor in the Code iComply team, and we're really pleased to welcome you to today's workshop. So with that in mind, let's have a look at today's session content. The first area that we're going to focus on today is we're going to have a look at some options that you might be able to consider before following a redundancy process. We'll then move on and have a look at how we can implement those with the team. So implementing those either temporary or permanent alternatives. We're going to cover a full change process with you, which will include stages right from the proposal, consultations, almost all the way through to the agreement stage. We'll then explore options to consider if you can't reach an agreement, as well as the risks that can be associated, just to really ensure that you've got all the information that you need before making any decisions. The next area we'll focus on has been very popular on the HR helpline this last week, and that's how to implement change with our self-employed team members. So we'll look at those steps that you need to take with you. We'll then, of course, give you some information around the redundancy process, and we'll focus a little more today around that selection criteria stage, as again, it's been a very popular area of discussion on our helpline. Something to consider is that we did talk a lot about the redundancy process in our last workshop, sort of this time last Thursday. That was recorded and it is on the Code UK website if you do need to refer to that one as well. So you may or may not know that this week is actually Mental Health Awareness Week. So we are just going to take a few minutes to focus on mental health wellbeing for yourself and for your team. And finally, we'll end the session with just a few brief updates to be aware of. And of course, you'll have an option to ask Kelly and myself any questions towards the end of the workshop today. So please do pop your questions in the Q&A box and we'll come to those at the end of today's workshop. So as I said, I'm going to hand over to Kelly now, who's going to give you some alternatives to redundancy that you may be able to consider.
So there is obviously a full range of business support at the moment from the government, such as the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, various loans and grants. The most common calls we have on our helplines is in regards to furlough. So employers can use this scheme to pay their employees 80% of their wages. And this can be on any contract type, including full-time, part-time, agency, and flexible or 0 hours contracts. So to be eligible for the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, employees cannot undertake work for or on behalf of the organisation or any linked or associated organisation. So this includes providing services or generating revenue. Employers can allocate business tasks to any other staff that are not furloughed. So apprentices can also be furloughed in the same way as any other employees, and they can continue to train whilst furloughed. So for the time they spend training, however, you must pay your apprentices at least the apprenticeship minimum wage. So or the national living wage or the national minimum wage, whichever is appropriate for the time they're spent training. So this means you must cover any shortfall between the amount you can claim for their wages and their appropriate minimum wage. So other alternatives you can consider is contractual layoff and short-time working. So as long as you have the layoff clause within your staff contracts and furlough is either no longer an option or they're not eligible, and as a business you don't have the work available, you can apply the layoff clause. Now, the layoff clause entitles the employee to 5 days of statutory pay over 3 months, and if you still need to use this option after 3 months, they will be entitled to another 5 days of statutory pay. Short-time working, again, applies if there isn't the work available, and you can look to reduce the amount of hours that employees do in the practice. And these measures are temporary, but there is no set time frame that these measures can go on for. However, if someone is laid off for 4 consecutive weeks in a row or 6 weeks in a 13-week period, they can apply for redundancy. Another option is temporary pay reductions. Although not something we recommend for morale and engagement reasons, however, if you have a good enough business reason to support your decisions, this could be something to explore with your team. If you do want to explore this option, consider how you approach it fairly with the team to avoid risks of discrimination. So temporary work pattern amends, a lot of practices are looking into this option. This is due to social distancing and in line with NHS and government guidelines. And it may be that you're asking your team to remain on the same working hours during the week, but to change their working pattern to minimise the amount of team members in the practice at one time. This also can be a permanent change, but we recommend reviewing this once we have a clearer understanding of the guidelines later in the year and what patient and staffing demands may require you to change. So just some other alternatives. So if you do at the moment offer overtime in your practice, you can look to either reduce or stop overtime altogether to avoid the additional cost every month with staff wages. If you review staff wages annually, and you are due to review the pay of your team members, you can freeze the pay, so an annual increase will not be offered to your team. Again, with these decisions, it's good practice to let them know the reasons for this, even if they aren't contractual. And I think the next point goes without saying that if you, to put a hold on recruitment, if you were originally looking to fill a vacant position, until you know what the changes are and what the impact of the coronavirus has had on your business, it is advised that you do put a hold on recruitment. And then seeking volunteers for flexible working, whether any of your team will voluntarily reduce their hours could also be an option to explore. Just making sure if any of your team choose to put in a flexible working request that you follow the correct procedure. Now I'm going to go over to my colleague Sophie, who's going to go through implementing changes.
Lovely, thanks Kelly. So thanks very much for those suggestions. I think we'll all agree there's some really good options to consider there, both temporary and permanent, that will hopefully help with the kind of measures that you may need to take to support you with the health and safety, and also perhaps maybe a phased return. So what we will do now is we're going to explore how we can start to implement some of those changes. Now, the process for agreeing both temporary and permanent changes is exactly the same. So it's the same procedure that you're going to be following and the same stages that we're going to go through today. So stage one, during this first stage, you're going to be planning and documenting exactly what you're trying to achieve. This will ultimately become your business case. So things to think about and consider here is why you believe it's a measure that's going to support the practice, how you see that measure working in practical terms, and exactly what impact that's going to have on your individual team members. Also consider thinking about your timescales. I know with saying that it's much easier said than done because we're not exactly sure on sort of timescales for the industry yet, but consider working backwards from what we do know, and have those clear timescales in place so you're giving yourself enough time to prepare, to consult, and to go through the stages. Also consider whether there could be any hidden costs. So for example, we spoke to a practice many months ago now who implemented an increase in hours, specifically to work on a Saturday. They did this, they followed a full, thorough sort of consultation process and got that across the line with the team, without actually realising that their employees' contract stated all work on Saturdays would be paid at 1.5 times their hourly rate. And what they didn't do is consult with them to reduce that rate. So therefore they had to consult all over again. They had to follow the same process, which is obviously very time consuming, to get that second change across the line. So I think what we're saying here is that it's important that we take our time in the business case stage to carry out those kind of checks before we go ahead and implement. Now, stage two is where you're going to be meeting with those team members who will be affected by the proposed change. During these meetings, you're going to be discussing the rationale, discussing your reasons, and explaining really what those changes are that you propose, and informing them that they will receive a letter following that meeting to invite them to an individual consultation. So that first meeting, that first stage proposal, is where you're meeting with all of those team members affected, and then following that up with your individual meetings. So moving on to stage three, that's where sort of stage 3 and stage 4 are quite similar, to be honest. They're all under the consultation banner. So this stage can actually consist of several different individual meetings with each of your team members. We very often get asked on the helpline, how many meetings or how long should a consultation last? Unfortunately, the answer is that there's no legal definition other than that it needs to be meaningful. Now, in this series of meetings, it's really your employees' opportunity to ask you questions, They may want to raise concerns that they have, or they could propose alternative suggestions for you to consider. So by showing that you're addressing your team members' concerns, answering any questions they may have, or considering those alternatives, you should be able to evidence really that you've met the requirement of the meaningful consultation. Now, during your consultations, it's also really good practice that you allow your employees to be accompanied, either by a colleague or a trade union representative. Now, it's also advisable that whoever is running the consultation, so that may be yourselves as practice owners, it could be your practice managers, so it's really advisable that they are also accompanied by a senior team member who will be able to take notes for them on their behalf. And having those notes can be really useful going forward because you may need to review or refer to them. Now, it's important just to note here that you may need to consider collective consultation, but that's only if the changes that you're making will affect 20 or more of your employees. If you are in this scenario, please do seek some expert sort of help here to support you with the process, because it is going to be a different process than the one we're following today. And then finally, on stage 3, it's where we are sort of thinking about the engagement. So by involving your team as much as practically possible, this will really help you with the changes and getting a better outcome. It will also lead to better engagement levels across the team. So yes, it is a requirement, but it will also help you too. And then stage 4 is where you're going to be seeking agreement from your employee for that proposed change. So here you will be discussing potentially the effective date, or perhaps you might need to negotiate a little to get it fully across the line. Moving on to stage 5. So stage 5 is where we are thinking about the positive outcomes. So the next couple of stages is when your employee has accepted and agreed to those changes. Now, obviously, we do know that there is an alternative to this, and Kelly will look at in a moment with you that less positive outcome if you perhaps come up against some resistance or refusal. But let's assume that you have agreement from your employee. So it's really important, first of all, that you have this documented. So this could be in the form of a letter following the consultation, just to confirm what changes have been made, if they're permanent or temporary changes, and when they will become effective from. Please do ensure that you're asking your employees to sign and date a copy of these letters to confirm their acceptance to the new terms. So this will become your really good, really robust audit trails. Our I Can Apply members in the workshop today, you will have access to our subsequent changes to terms and conditions letter. The module reference is on the screen for you to jot down now, and you'll be able to utilise that if you are in this scenario. And finally, the last stage is to support the team with those implemented changes. So ensure that it's working for them as well as yourself, and that will really help you to keep the team engaged and sort of boost the morale during this time period. And also review the changes you've made on a regular basis to ensure that it is working for the practice. So to ensure really that your business case has proved successful. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, I'm going to hand you back over to Kelly now, who has the slightly less glamorous job of talking you through resistance or refusal.
Thank you, Sophie. So if in the event some of your team members refuse your proposal, you can explore the following options. So something we recommend is looking to incentivise and negotiate the proposal. So for example, if you are looking to change their working pattern and they usually work 30 hours over Monday to Friday, but you need to open longer throughout the week and working 10-hour shifts isn't something they're particularly keen on doing, you could negotiate an offer that if they work this Monday to Wednesday, so they fit 3 10-hour shifts Monday to Wednesday, they could get a long weekend every week with Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday off. You can look to review these changes on a 3 to 4 week basis and get the team involved, whether they need to tweak or completely change the current setup. So you could also look to offer additional holiday days as a thank you for being so cooperative, should they be willing to make those changes. So should that refusal continue and they don't want to make those changes, you can ask them to put the refusal in writing. And if a team member will not negotiate or accept any incentives, you can look to go down the grievance route. You would need to investigate and find out why this team member doesn't want to make these temporary changes. So the next option is dismissal and re-engagement on new terms. This does come with risks, which Sophie will go on about in the next slide, and is something we recommend is a last resort. However, you will need to still follow practice policies and procedures. These do still apply, and you would look to re-engage on new terms.
So as Kelly just touched upon there, the risks are really quite high if you do choose to enforce a contract amendment upon an employee. So it can be good to know exactly what these risks are to ensure that you can mitigate them as much as you can, really. The first risk to be aware of is that of an unlawful deduction of wages claim. Now, this would be a claim that your employee would raise with ACAS, and it's only able to proceed on the grounds if it's actually happened. So an actual physical deduction has been made from your employee's wages. That's when they would have the right to raise this claim. So an example of this could be sort of thinking about this kind of scenario. Perhaps you force through a reduction in pay that's related to an enforced reduction in hours. So this could be an unlawful deduction of their wages because it would be a reduction in their pay. It could be that you enforce a pay cut, as well as for things such like a removal of a bonus scheme or a removal of a commission schedule. So it's important that you do follow your procedures to ensure that you've got signed agreements in place, and this will really reduce your risks of the unlawful deduction of wages claim. The second risk to be aware of is that of constructive dismissal. This only becomes a risk if your employee subsequently resigns after the changes have been enforced. And the reasons for the resignation would be linked to the enforced change, or because they feel that they've been forced out of the practice by their sort of employer, by the management. So again, following your procedures will help you here, because it may mean that you could consider some small negotiations that would really help you to seek that agreement rather than following the full enforcement stage. Unfair dismissal can occur if you do choose to terminate your employee's contract and offer that re-engagement on new terms that Kelly just spoke about. The reason being is that you've ultimately ended the employment with the practice, so you will have needed to be able to evidence that you followed a fair process to do so. And just a reminder really, for both constructive and unfair dismissal claims, an employee would need 2 years of continuous service to be eligible to bring this type of claim to ACAS and to an employment tribunal. Moving on to one of the biggest risk factors to be aware of, and that is of discrimination. The reason that it's one of the biggest risks is due to the fact that your employees, first of all, don't need any qualifying length of service to raise a discrimination claim. And secondly, successful discrimination claims in a tribunal are actually uncapped compensation can be awarded to that employee. So for 2 reasons, it's one of the biggest risk factors to be aware of. So this type of claim can occur in these sort of enforcement scenarios if your team member feels that they have been treated unfairly, or potentially feels that they've been treated at a detriment due to a protected characteristic. So for example, because of their age, because of their race, religion, or even because of their gender. Now, the most common type here, so to put it into a bit of context for you, the most common type to be aware of in this type of scenario is when you're enforcing work pattern changes, and that's when they're enforced on team members with childcare responsibilities, as case law has actually shown and proved to us that that could be considered sex discrimination. The reason being is that childcare responsibilities more often than not lie with your female employees, so they could potentially have a case of sex discrimination if you're forcing that through. Now, if your employees are unhappy or if they feel that they've been poorly treated, you're also at risk of them raising a grievance. And grievances can be very time consuming to follow that process, and some can take even months to address. So the risk here is that you could be losing really precious time when your biggest focus over the next weeks, sort of coming weeks and months, is really going to be around the practice bounce back. If you are in a situation of investigating and hearing a grievance, we would really recommend getting some expert support to help you with that process. And actually, our colleague Hannah has hosted a really informative webinar on this topic a few months ago. So I would encourage you to take a look at that one, which is available on our Code website. Unfortunately, having a culture of enforced change, or even a culture of sort of lots of grievances, can really breed poor morale and a negative workplace environment at the practice. This again is going to cost you time to address. So it would be time to address where the issues are coming from, potentially more grievances on your hands there. So it could also be picked up on by your patients. So if they have the feeling that they're not being potentially treated, if your team members aren't performing, your patients may not feel that they are being treated in the way that they should be. That can obviously have a bit of a sort of detrimental impact on your practice reputation too. All in all, it is quite a tricky and risky situation to be in. So we can't recommend highly enough that getting your team involved throughout the change process and following your procedures will really help you to avoid going down this kind of route. Now I'm going to hand you back over to Kelly, who's going to talk you through how we can implement change with our self-employed team members.
Thank you. So with self-employed, essentially you also have to go through a very similar process to explain the reasons you want to make these changes and propose to them the changes to their contract with their notice period that is in their contract of services. You will need to get agreement of these new terms, and we recommend explaining the reasons for these decisions. Now, a lot of practices are asking their self-employed team members to take a percentage cut. So whether that's 5 or 10% is something we'd recommend that you mutually agree. And as mentioned, you will need to have this agreed by your associate to make any changes, and any changes that are made, we'd recommend producing a letter of confirmation or an updated agreement. So should you fail to agree, you would need to further discuss how you'll move forward with your contract for services. So this is something you will need to deal with on a case-by-case basis, and if you are finding it difficult coming to an agreement, we'd recommend seeking expert advice. So the risks to making changes without prior agreement could be breach of contract and also discrimination. So discrimination was covered in the last webinar, but just to recap on the 9 protected characteristics is age, disability, gender reassignment, whether under medical supervision or not, marriage or civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race on the basis of colour, ethnic origin, nationality or citizenship, religion or belief, includes a lack of religion, faith or belief, sex and sexual orientation. So when making these decisions, we just highly recommend that you promote a diverse and equal workplace environment and to take into account the protected characteristics and types of discrimination before finalising your measures. And I'm going to hand back to Sophie now, who's going to go through the last resort.
So we do obviously understand, and we fully appreciate that some of the alternative measures that Kelly advised on may not work for every practice, and you could be in a position where redundancy is the only option. We did cover last week a full redundancy process for you, and we do have our HR Return to Work guide available in the in the handout section for you today to be able to download, and that will give you sort of a bit more information on each stage that we advise following. But we are just going to briefly recap for you today, as we know it's a consideration that practices are really looking at, and you do want to know some more information on it. So the first step then is where you are defining, is what we define as the planning stage. So this is where you're going to be preparing your rationale that's led you to your decision. You're going to be looking at what you've done to this point to try and avoid this route as well. It's during this stage that you'll be able to identify the roles that are at risk in the practice. And as we mentioned in the last workshop, it's the roles that are important to identify, not the individuals, as this is going to mitigate your risk of a potential claim of discrimination. So to put that into context for you, if you've identified that your receptionist role is sort of at risk of redundancy, but actually you need to retain maybe one member of the reception team, and your team has 3 team members in that reception role, what you would be doing is identifying that your reception role is at risk of redundancy, not those 2 individuals. So moving on to the meeting and consulting stage. So these are the middle stages really that will involve meeting with the team members. Firstly, on a group basis to break the news that their role is at risk of redundancy. So for your reception role, let's just stick with that example, you would be meeting with all 3 of those receptionists to inform them that their role is at risk of redundancy. And you'd then follow up with individual consultations. That's very similar to the implementing change process you'll probably have picked up on there. Now, do remember that there will often be more than one consultation meeting during a redundancy process. And as with the implementing change, there's no defined timescale or no defined limit on how many meetings you can have. Again, you just need to be able to evidence that you've had a meaningful consultation. Now, moving on to the next stage. So if your at-risk role has more than one employee in that position, you will need to formulate a fair method of selecting the redundant employee. A way of completing this stage is by using what is termed as a selection criteria. It will include determining exactly what criteria you're going to use to score your employees on, which will ultimately help you to identify which of those team members will be dismissed for reasons of redundancy. You are required to share the scores with the individual team members, so do ensure that you've used a really fair, consistent and non-discriminatory criteria. In the next slide, Kelly is going to look at this in more detail, and she's going to provide you with some sort of topics really that you would be able to sort of look at involving in a selection criteria. And the reason we've kind of zoned in on the selection criteria today is that we found it's another really sort of high volume topic on our HR helpline. And once those scoring has been completed, you've probably guessed it by now, you will need to meet with them again individually to discuss the scores with them. Before confirming that an employee is dismissed for reasons of redundancy, it is a requirement that you need to consider if there are any suitable alternative roles or any current vacancies in the practice that that team member could be suitable for. If you have identified that there is a role that you have in mind, the terms of that role do need to be similar in terms of the skill level and the conditions, so things about like the rate of pay and the work pattern. If you have identified that, you will need to discuss it during a consultation meeting with the team member. Now, moving on to the final stages. So the final consultation meeting, during this meeting, you'll be issuing your selected employee with notice of their redundancy. The meeting will reiterate the process that you followed, and you can briefly recap on the meetings to date. So it's really good practice if you've had questions from that team member or been given alternatives to look at, that you just recap and discuss those again at the meeting to ensure that you can evidence a meaningful consultation. If your employee has nothing further to add, you will be able to provide them with the verbal confirmation that they've been selected for redundancy, and you can confirm those exit arrangements. So talking about things like the notice period, if any redundancy pay is applicable, as well as things like holiday accrual. This meeting can be quite an emotional one for yourself and for the team member, so I'd go into it really fully prepared. The meeting should be followed up in writing to ensure that you've got written confirmation and a written audit trail that notice has been issued to that team member, and your employee will have the right to appeal your decision. So do ensure that that is also documented in the letter. Now, the final stage in the redundancy process is supporting the team who you have left within the practice, as they can quite often feel sort of a bit upset, maybe anxious or stressed about the future. If you think about it in the fact that, you know, we probably, well, I mean, before all this started, we spent more time with our sort of team members and our colleagues than we probably did with our families. So they do become friends. So if somebody who they considered a friend has been made redundant, it might be that they're feeling, you know, a little bit upset and a little bit sensitive during that time period. Communication is going to be really key here to ensure that they feel supported and valued. Kelly is now going to help you with looking at some tips on what could be included in a fair selection criteria.
Thank you, Sophie. So if in the unfortunate event you do have to follow the redundancy procedure, you will have to have a fair selection criteria. You must select employees for redundancy in a fair way and not discriminate against any individuals or groups. So you can base your criteria on the knowledge your team members have. So for example, the job they do, the patients that they regularly speak to and know, the dental plans that you offer in the practice, compliance, and the practice itself. You can also score for versatility, so the ability and willingness to perform different functions and duties in the practice. So you could have a dental nurse that is able to work on reception as well as assist an associate in surgery. So job performance, you can look back at historic appraisal data and whether your individuals hit their set objectives and targets and whether their overall performance is good or exceeding expectations. And you can also base it on the relevant qualifications for the job and whether the training and skills that each individual has may be more than the other to be able to perform certain jobs and duties within the practice. So attendance, as long as you don't discriminate against a lack of attendance in accordance with the protected characteristics such as pregnancy, maternity, caring for dependents and disability, you can use this as part of your criteria as well. So for our total HR members, in the HR application, you can use the Bradford factor calculation tool. So this tool enables you to score their attendance and use this as evidence for the criteria. Otherwise, as long as you have accurate data of your employees' attendance, you can reflect this on the selection criteria. So timekeeping, again, as long as you have accurate data to show timekeeping issues for not arriving to work on time and having those conversations, this can be another criteria option. And of course, disciplinary records. You can look back at the amount of warnings on their personnel file and score this against other team members. It's also important you do not discriminate. So for example, if you use flexible working as a criteria, you could be discriminating against women. You would need to show that flexible working is no longer possible after your business has changed. So during the coronavirus pandemic, you must not select employees for redundancy just because they are shielding. This could be a disability discrimination. And you should consult employees to identify and agree selection criteria. So for example, you could sit with employees to work out the skills and experience needed for your business in the future. And the more open and collaborative your selection process is, the more your employees will trust this is a fair process. So Sophie is going to go through the risks of not following the redundancy process.
Lovely, thanks Kelly. So as you have probably already picked up on, the topics that we are covering today are quite risk heavy, and we wouldn't be doing our jobs here in the HR team if we didn't ensure that you are fully aware of those risk elements. It's really to ensure that you are making informed decisions about the future of your team and the future of your practice. So the risks are in some way, excuse me, similar to enforcing the change process. The first one that we're now all aware of is the unfair dismissal. But just to recap, an employee must have 2 years service to raise this type of claim. And it would occur in these type of circumstances if they feel that you've not followed a fair process leading to their role being confirmed as redundant. There is a current cap on the unfair dismissal compensation claim, and that's £88,519. So that, as you are probably fully aware, that's a pretty heavy a heavy sum there. So they are really costly mistakes to make. That's why it's really important to follow your redundancy procedures, which can include the consultation, the right to be accompanied, a fair selection criteria, right through to the right to appeal, as all of those sort of stages really form part of the ACAS code of practice. Failure to follow the ACAS code of practice can result in a 25% uplift in compensation if the complaint was to reach an employment tribunal and be successful. So again, very costly and relatively easy to mitigate just by ensuring that you're aware of your employees' rights and following the correct process. Wrongful dismissal is one that's quite often forgot about, but this is when an employer breaches the employee's contract. So the most common example in the redundancy process is if they fail to pay the redundancy, if they fail to pay the notice, or even the outstanding holiday. So ensure that, thinking right back to our planning stage, ensure that during this stage, you're aware of all of those costs that are involved. You've worked out exactly what you would need to pay in that final pay to ensure that you're mitigating your risk of a wrongful dismissal claim. Again, like with the enforced changes, you also have the risk of discrimination here too, in exactly the same way. So it's if your employee feels that you've treated them unfairly or at a detriment due to a protected characteristic. Now, if you have a reputation for treating your team unfairly, you will be highly likely to struggle with the morale and the performance of your team, as well as thinking long-term about your recruitment. This will also more than likely be picked up on by your patients, as well as it could tarnish their experience and your reputation. Sorting out and trying to unpick issues after they've happened, defending claims with early conciliation, that's ACAS, or at an employment tribunal is going to cost you a lot of time, a lot of money, and it can put a lot of undue pressure and stress on you as a person. It's quite a draining process to follow and have to go down. And as I think you can probably see, it's easily avoidable, just ensuring that you're taking your time to plan and to follow your redundancy process properly. What I would say is try not to rush this process. I know it's incredibly tempting to do so, but just think about the time that you're spending now could be saving you a lot of time, money, and effort going forward. I'm going to hand you back over to Kelly now, who's going to talk to you about mental health wellbeing, as it is a topical subject this week, with it being Mental Health Awareness Week.
Thank you. So yeah, as Sophie says, it is Mental Health Awareness Week. So we're just going to talk about some ways in which you as employers can help your team if they're struggling with their mental health. And of course, it's important to be looking after yourself in these times. And I know we go on about it a lot, but connecting and communicating with your team is more important than ever. So regardless of whether they are furloughed, whether your team are working from home or if they're still working in the practice, they may be struggling, and it is a good starting point to just ask how they're feeling. And should they wish to confide in you about their mental well-being, knowing where to start can be, incredibly difficult. It's worth finding out firstly if they have family members or friends that they speak to regularly, and if they'd be comfortable talking to them about how they're feeling. Making the most of technology, especially during this period, just staying in touch with loved ones is certainly a way of building stronger relationships, and it can uplift your mood. And although we can't change the current social distancing rules, it is important not to solely rely on technology and social media to communicate. It can become an unhealthy habit, and it is good to talk and meet people, face to face. And if someone does come to you with their worries, it can be a big step for them. So it's just good to recognise and reassure them that you're there to listen. And if they don't want your support, don't force it, and just let them know that you are available to chat, without judgment there. So, fitness, again, it's as an employer, you can encourage your team members to lead an active lifestyle. It is proven to raise self-esteem. It helps an individual set goals or challenges and have something to focus their time and energy on. It is important to find an activity that you or they enjoy and how you can incorporate this into daily routine. There are so many different apps and online workout videos to help anybody get started on just the basics. And there's a very popular app, which is Couch to 5K, which week by week will coach you to improve your running style and the distance. So physical activity is proven to cause chemical changes in your brain, which can positively improve a person's mood. And it is also worth mentioning that activities such as yoga and meditation can really boost your mental health and reduce stress and anxiety. So getting creative. Now, I know everybody does have their own creative flair. Everyone has their own interests and hobbies. This could range from art, sewing, baking, writing, woodwork, or even gardening. So just focusing purely on something that you enjoy or they enjoy can really boost self-confidence. It can build a sense of purpose, and it can really help us connect with others that likewise enjoy doing the same things. Now, I know as an employer, this can be quite hard to initiate, getting your team members, involved in what they actually love doing, especially if they're feeling quite low. But what it might be worth doing is, if your team members are particularly good at hobby, if they're able to help towards a community appeal that you know about, or whether it's decoration within the practice, what better way to promote their creativeness? And in the same context, it's helping them to steer their stress and anxiety into a new project and self-worth. So focusing on the now. So a lot of anxiety, stress and fear stems from the unknown future. So paying attention to today and where you are at present can improve anybody's mental well-being. Now, it's something to make your team aware of is mindfulness. So the awareness of your thoughts, feelings, and your physical being as it is now. There are a lot of information on this on the mental health charity website Mind, and how people can make small changes to focus their thoughts on the present moment. Now, as well as external organisations such as Mind, meditation and yoga helps the brain focus on the present moment. So just to know the signs of someone that may be struggling, it is important to look out for these, and you as practice owners will be able to, point this out as well. You'll know your team members better than anyone. So decreased energy, anger or irritability, low mood, difficulty concentrating or making decisions, feeling hopeless, changes in appetite. So this could be eating more or eating less, difficulty sleeping, loss of interest, and this could include in their hobbies. So this could be where you can introduce a project for them. Persistent feelings of sadness, anxiety, or emptiness, a racing heart, restlessness, dread and panic, and then difficulty controlling that worry and fear. Now, we all have felt anxious, worried, and low at times, and that is just part of our life journey. It's just when these feelings are prolonged and can get worse, it can affect us and can be considered as a problem. So it's just to be aware. It would be good that you express your concern and reassure your team members, to offer your time and to be patient. This may be their first time that they're opening up about their feelings, to offer help. So this could be where acts of kindness come in, and most importantly, look after yourself. I know we go on a lot about team members during these webinars, but we are very aware that all practice owners and practice managers are very stressed at the moment, with the uncertainty of the future. What's it going to look like on your return to the practice? How are you going to get your team members back? All these different things. And it'd just be good if you just take a couple of points from today's webinar and lead by example to your team members to positively improve your own mental and physical well-being. And don't be a stranger to your own thoughts. Talk about it, and there is always someone willing to listen, even us at Code. You may think it's insignificant, but it's not. So yeah, hopefully this has turned that frown upside down. Now we're going to go back to Sophie, who's going to go through some of the updates in regards to the current situation.
Well, thanks, Kelly. So yeah, as Kelly mentioned, just before we move into the Q&A section of today's workshop, we just really wanted to make you aware of a couple of updates that may affect you. The first one is that the statutory sick pay rebate scheme has now been, we have a confirmed date for when that portal will be live. It's been announced that it will be live from the 26th of May. So this scheme, if you're not aware, could potentially entitle you to claim up to 2 weeks of statutory sick pay if your team members have been off with coronavirus-related absence. You will need your government gateway ID, as you do with your furlough claim process, to be able to access that rebate portal. The second update is that the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme has been extended until the end of October. So up to the end of July, the scheme will be as it stands currently, but from August, employers currently using the scheme will have some more flexibility to bring their furloughed employees back to work on potentially like a part-time basis, while still receiving some support from the scheme. This could really help and support you with a phased return to the practice, for example, or potentially could be used as an alternative to a redundancy. We also want to make you aware of some documents that we have prepared for you that will hopefully help and support you during this unprecedented time. These are all available in the download section of the workshop, so in the handout section, and that's the Get Your Practice Back on Track, which is your total HR guide. You've got an I Comply Bounce Back action plan, as well as a COVID-19 return to work form. Now that form, if you needed more information on that, we did cover that form in last week's webinar that's available on the website to watch. But that form can really help and support you with the conversations and the process of that return to work with employees. We also, just before we move into the Q&A, just wanted to let you know that we have an expert Q&A panel next Thursday the 28th. The Q&A session next week will be hosted by our very own new business manager Samantha, and our expert guests will be Dr. Andrea Ubi, who is the Director of Andrea Ubi Dentistry and Love Dental. We'll also have Lisa Bainham, who is President of ADAM, which is the Association of Dental Administrators and Managers, and Tracy Stewart, who is an expert in change management and people behaviour. Tracy is also a fantastic speaker and a coach. If you do want to book onto that webinar, there should be a link on your screen now that will enable you to sign up. And just before we do move into the Q&A, we also just want to make you aware that we've got some really fantastic offers running until the end of May, with savings for both members and non-members of up to £600. So if you are interested in speaking to a member of the team about the services that we provide, please do click on the book here sort of button that will be up on your screen shortly, and that will take you through to a page where you can book a convenient time to speak to one of our team.